Well, hello, friends. Over the past 5 weeks, we've been considering the message of First Peter and how it applies to followers of Jesus in America in 2021. Now, Peter originally wrote this letter to followers of Jesus who were scattered across the Roman Empire, and he addresses them as exiles. Now, it's hard to live as an exile, to live in a place that is not your home, to be around people with different values and convictions than you have. And so Peter writes this letter to encourage his hearers and give them perspective to be able to continue to live as exiles, especially as suffering and persecution come. Now, last week we considered 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 14, and how Peter gave his hearers a motivation to live faithfully as an exile by helping them look forward to the future revelation of Jesus Christ. That when Jesus Christ is revealed to the whole world for who he truly is, those who have faithfully followed him will be seen as wise, though they may not be seen this way now. Followers of Christ on that day will experience reward and great joy. So Christian exiles gain motivation for faithful living by looking forward to the future revelation of Jesus Christ. Now, today, we're going to consider how it's also necessary for followers of Jesus in exile to look backward to gain motivation for faithful living. I'm going to read a little bit longer passage today, 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 14 through 21. So let me read the passage and we'll dig in. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And if you call on him as Father, who judges impartially according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot. Peter reminds his hearers that they are in a time of exile, and that they are to conduct themselves with fear, a reverent fear of God during this time of exile. Now, first of all, just notice that during their time of exile, he doesn't direct their attention to the conduct of those around them in the world. And there was much about the conduct of those in the Roman Empire that was completely ungodly. There was lots of call for change in the patterns of behavior in the world. But that's not where he directs the attention of his hearers. He's talking about their conduct, how they are to conduct themselves during the time of their exile. And he calls them to live with a reverent fear of God, distinct from the patterns of behavior of those around them. And he does this by focusing on two things that he calls them to look back upon. So today we'll consider two things that we need to look back upon if we are to live faithfully as spiritual exiles. First, he says, look back and recognize the foolishness of worldly patterns of behavior. In verse 18, he reminded them, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited by your forefathers. So he's talking about prior patterns of behavior, prior to their life in Christ, ways of living that he labels as futile ways. Futile refers to behaviors that don't really work. An empty way of life, a pointless, a purposeless kind of life. So he's telling them that their former ways of living, their former behavioral patterns, were futile. Remember, they were futile. In verse 14, he had reminded them not to be conformed to the passions of their former ignorance. So he's reminding them that their former ways of living were really ignorant ways of living. They weren't aware of the gospel of Jesus Christ and the opportunity they had to live differently under the rule of Jesus Christ. And he says, now that you do know this, those former ways seem ignorant in comparison. So Peter is reminding them that living according to worldly patterns is actually a futile and ignorant idea. Now, he has to remind them of this because as exiles, their behavior patterns are to be different and distinct than the normal patterns of living around them. And that creates difficulty. It sure seemed in the moment that some of the worldly patterns they saw around them benefited those that lived this way, whether it was questionable business practices, greed, deceit, that in the moment seemed to cause people to get ahead. That worldly pattern in the moment seemed to work. He's reminding them, no, it's actually a futile and ignorant way of living. Christians are to have a very distinct sexual ethic. And at times, that can seem in the moment that you are giving up pleasure. But he's saying, no, it's actually a futile and ignorant pattern of behavior. See, I think there's a couple ways that Christians can be tempted to conform to worldly patterns. First of all, it's simply conforming to what our culture says is right and good, whether it's business practices, sexual ethics. What our culture says is good is not often what God says is good. And Christians are to remember that we are to trust God and His Word and not adjust our standards to match those of the world around us. Now, I think most of us recognize that truth, though we may find it difficult to consistently live it. But I think that most Christians do recognize that we need to trust what God says is right and good is correct. But I think there's a second, more subtle way of conforming to cultural patterns that we need to remember are also wrong. And that is that we are tempted to conform to cultural patterns about how to advance our cause. That as Christians, we have a cause, we have a mission. And at times it can be tempting to use worldly means to advance God's cause, which is why Peter goes on in this book. And he is reminding them that instead of fighting when persecuted, they are to respond back with the manner of Christ, that we're not to return evil for evil. He talks to them about their speech and how our speech is to be characterized differently, that instead of lashing back, responding with rash and unkind words, our words are to be gracious, or as Paul would say, seasoned with salt. That we are to rejoice when persecuted and be willing to suffer. This is a very different pattern for living than the world has. And as Christians, we need to remember this, that Jesus has set us a different pattern for responding to persecution and suffering. So whether it is conforming to what our culture says is right and good, or whether it is conforming to how our culture says to advance your cause when opposed, Christians are not to conform to either of those patterns. Now, it's tempting, and it always will be tempting, to conform to those patterns. But one of the ways we avoid doing so is to look back at the fruit of our participation in worldly behaviors in the past and see where those behaviors led. Paul did this in the book of Titus. In Titus chapter 3, verse 3, he says, "We ourselves were once foolish, disobedient, led astray, slaves to various passions and pleasures, passing our days in malice and envy, hated by others and hating one another." You see, those behaviors are ignorant and futile. They don't lead to love, joy, peace. They lead to division, discontentment, and hatred. And so we need to remember when we are tempted to conform to worldly patterns that our participation in worldly patterns in the past has not led us to the things that God says are right and good. So looking back at the foolishness of our past participation in worldly patterns leads us to the second thing we must also look backward at. If it was only looking back at the foolishness of our former ways of living, this would actually not be all that encouraging or helpful. But this second element is essential. Peter says to look back at how high a cost has been paid to rescue us from our foolish ways of living. Verse 18 through 21 says, knowing that you were ransomed from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, not with perishable things, such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ. Peter doesn't say, look back on your prior foolish ways of living and learn your lesson. Right your wrongs. Be a better person. He doesn't say that because, first of all, it doesn't really work. We lack the willpower necessary to truly change, to permanently change. But secondly, even if we are able to experience some level of temporary behavioral improvement, it usually leads to self-righteousness and pride, not compassion. We then tend to respond to the ignorant and futile behavior of others with comparison, condemnation, and mocking. Much of the public discourse in our culture today is marked by attempts to condemn what is considered to be ignorant and futile views in the people that are being opposed. We must never forget that God responded to our ignorant and futile behavior, not with disdain, mocking, or condemnation, but with self-sacrificing love. He demonstrated his love for us, that while we were still stuck in our ignorance and our futile behaviors, our sin, Christ died for us. He gave his very life and blood to ransom and rescue us. Therefore, as followers of Christ, as we look back and remember the precious blood that was poured out to rescue us, we have a motivation and a power to live distinct from the worldly patterns around us. See, looking back at the cross of Christ enables us to live as exiles without conforming and without complaining. So I pray that God gives us ample reminders this week of his great love for us, revealed in the cross of Christ. And I pray that as we dwell on the high cost that was paid to ransom us, that we will be strengthened to live with reverent fear during the time of our exile. Hope you have a great week.